She will not force
We're off. Welcome to today's research conversations. We have two star researchers who will be talking to us today, and we shall be starting Professor Ulrike Roesler, Professor of Tibetan and Himalayan Studies in this university, where she's been teaching for quite a number of years, both on her main subject now, Tibetan, but before that on Buddhism. And she's going to be in conversation with Professor Alison Salvesen. Alison.
Great welcome to our Chair of Faculty, of course, and also to Ulrike as a wonderful colleague, particularly in Tibetan. I'm looking forward to this.
Thank you. What I'm going to talk about today is a new book project, and I should really emphasize that because it is work in progress. So you will hear things that are still in the making, and I look really forward to having some feedback on that afterwards. The basic question that I want to address is, how did monasticism become popular in Tibet in a culture that didn't have anything like it before? You didn't have any of these institutional mechanisms and structures in place. So why on earth would the Tibetans get excited about monasticism and decide to found these big monastic institutions that became then so important for Tibetan culture? And to look at this, I will look at a case study, that's the monastery of Retting, and you will soon see a bit more about that. So first of all, if people think about Tibet, I think it very often evokes these images of monks in maroon robes, or the old lady with the Buddhist prayer wheel, or people think about the Dalai Lama. So it's very strongly shaped by this idea that being Tibetan means being Buddhist. However, we have to keep in mind that historically speaking, that has not always been so, and actually Buddhism is a relative latecomer on the Tibetan plateau. The first records of Buddhism in Tibet are from the 7th century, so that's much, much later than in all the surrounding areas, later than in India, in Nepal, Kashmir, the Gandhara region, Central Asia, China. They all had Buddhism centuries before the Tibetans adopted it. Here you see the first Buddhist king of Tibet, King Songtsen-Gampo, who is known as the person who introduced Buddhism for the first time. But we have to keep in mind that during this period, Buddhism was far from being a mass movement. There was no big lay support for Buddhism. It was pretty much a royal project. It had royal sponsorship, but even within the court it was contested. So it was not firmly established in the beginning at all. That changes in the 11th century. Politically, that's a time where regional kingdoms are re-established after a period of chaos in Tibet. And these local rulers across the Tibetan plateau, they invoke this memory of the glorious time of the Tibetan Empire, where you had these Buddhist rulers and the unified country. And that leads to a renewal of patronage for Buddhism on the Tibetan plateau. But this time, the Buddhist movement is not restricted to these elite circles and the aristocracy, but it really becomes popular among the laity. And so my question is, why is that happening? How is that happening? And in particular also, how did monasteries become so important in this context? And so first of all, if you think about the factors that lead to these movements, first of all, obviously you need people who want to convert to Buddhism. So you need reasons why people would do that, and maybe we can talk about it a bit later afterwards. I think there are a few things that would make Buddhism quite attractive and quite popular. Apart from the people who become Buddhists, I think we can also pinpoint a number of contributing factors that can strengthen a monastic tradition and really lead to a long-term success of both Buddhism and monasticism in Tibet. And that's what I'm planning to look at in the book. And I think you need a number of things. First of all, you need something like a charismatic founder. You need a founding figure who founds a monastery and attracts students and makes it a success. monasteries cost money. You need patronage. Someone has to pay for it. If you're a Tibetan Buddhist, you also want an Indian Buddhist lineage, because Buddhism comes from India. You want it to be authentic, so it has to be an Indian transmission lineage from teacher to student that leads to into your own tradition. Then ideally, you also want something local, something that's familiar to people. And that could be in the Tibetan context, for example, the cult of mountain deities, which is very, very important and very prominent in Tibet. You might want to adopt some protective deities that strengthen your tradition. And then, if you want to make it a long-term success, you need teacher-student networks to ensure the continuity, but also the spread. You want something that no one else has. You're a special meditation technique, you're a special philosophical system, you're a wonderful monastic dance that no one else can do, these types of things. And in order to pass that on through the generations, you would normally also want to use something like legends about the founders, about the place, about the tradition, a bit of mythology that is transformed into a kind of master narrative of who this tradition is, what makes them distinct. And if you want to transmit this master narrative, you obviously need the media to do that. You need a textual transmission, but also ideally publication technology. In Tibet, that's block printing, so wooden printing blocks that became more widespread from the 15th century onwards, so that's a few centuries after the time I'm looking at, but it had a big impact on the spread of these traditions. So, in my mind, these are factors I want to look at in the book, and obviously today we won't have time to look at all of them, but we can at least have a look at some. So here is the monastery of Retting. That's my case study. It's in Central Tibet. It was founded in 1057, and it became a nucleus from which Buddhism spread in the region, because several of the monks from this monastery founded their own branch monasteries in the area. So this really triggered a large-scale monastic tradition in Central Tibet, and that's why I think it's a good case to look at. Fortunately, we are quite well informed. We have a lot of textual sources in Tibetan from around the 12th century onwards, including biographies, hagiographies, historical works, pilgrimage guides, and even letters between monasteries, which are really fascinating sources that tell you about what was actually really going on. So I think we are able to get a fairly rounded picture, even if most of these sources are religious texts, and in that sense tend to be quite pious. But if we compare, we can still learn a lot about how all of this worked. And coming back to these factors, you can hardly see that. There are meant to be red squares around the charismatic founder and patronage. And so we are quite well informed about those in the case of Retting. This is the founder of the monastery, Jomdenpa. He is from the famous Jom family, which was very influential in the area. And we know that this family was involved in the textual transmission for more than 200 years, 250 years approximately. So was really instrumental in moving it forward. We also know the patrons, that's the Berg clan, which is a local clan in the region who, again, we can trace by name over about 5 generations as sponsors of the tradition. So we know quite well how it worked in practical terms. Now, if we look at inclusion of local traditions, protective deities, and how all of that feeds into mythology and legend and this master narrative of the tradition. We can see that in Tibet we have local traditions of deities and spirits that inhabit the land, mountain gods, mountain deities, were an old indigenous feature of Tibetan religiosity. Now, in the case of Retting Monastery, there is also such a protective deity, He's called Chinkarwa, which means the guy with the white hat, the turban, which is a sign of kingship. In ancient Tibet, this is what the kings were wearing. So he's a warrior king, and he protects the place, he protects the monastery, and is totally imagined in the imagery of the indigenous Tibetan tradition of mountain gods, warrior gods, who act as protectors of their territory. So in traditional Tibet, it would look like this. You have your mountain god at the center of his kingdom, and he would be in charge of ensuring well-being, long life, health for people and animals. Now, getting back to our god Chinkarwa in Retting, he is actually located on a mountain. A mountain is his seat, so that shows that he's really imagined like an ancient Tibetan mountain god. And the mountain is this one, that's where he lives. And you can see that the mountain is right behind the monastery. And Chinkarwa, this king, warrior king, is imagined as a protector of the monastic tradition, sitting right at the back, protecting it from behind. And normally, this is in summer, normally this mountain would have snow on top, so it would also have this white headdress, similar to the mountain god. This idea of mountain gods, sacred landscapes, mountains that have a special significance, also resonates beautifully with Buddhist cosmology, because in Buddhist cosmology you also have the idea that at the center of the cosmos there is a mountain, a central mountain, and in the Buddhist worldview you have certain attributes of a good Buddhist king who is in charge of the world, and he needs certain things like his queen, his general, his minister, a treasury, the wheel that stands for the wheel of the Buddhist doctrine, a royal elephant, a royal horse, and a wish-fulfilling jewel that will grant all wishes in the kingdom. Now, if you look at the legends around Retting Monastery, you find that actually they do something very similar, but in this case, the monastery itself would form the center, rather than a mountain. And around this monastery, if you ask people in Retting nowadays, they will still know these things. They can point out that mountain is the king, that mountain is the general, that mountain is the treasurer, that's the queen. So they have populated the mountains around the monastery with these symbols of the perfect Buddhist kingship. So I think what we have is indigenous tradition where you have the mountain at the center, Buddhist cosmology where you have the mountain at the center, Retting Monastery where they put this monastery at the center and the mountains all around. And I think that's a very, very powerful narrative and imagery that has been popular really throughout the centuries. And you find it in many legends and texts about the place, and it's still a living tradition nowadays. So I think these things can really help to propagate Buddhism and to support the success of a tradition. So I'll come back to this and I'll close with this. And so currently these are my ideas, what I want to look at and write about. And I'm now very curious what you think about it. And I'm also curious whether this is something that's actually very specific to Tibet or to Buddhism, or whether there would be similar developments elsewhere in the world and in other religions.
Just check how much time we've got. Thank you, that was absolutely fascinating. It raised a whole lot of questions in my mind. I'm not at all an expert on sort of Western monasticism or Middle Eastern monasticism, but I'm kind of aware of some of the issues there. Particularly the idea of the charismatic founder, I think, is something that is a point of contact where you have, say, Anthony of Egypt, St. Francis in the later tradition, and St. Benedict, revered figures who set this up. How far do you think the figure needs to be historical, and how far do you think the figure needs to be kind of semi-legendary?
The figure would always be regarded as historical. In the earliest period of Buddhism, during the time of the Empire, 7th, 8th century, some of the figures are a bit nebulous. We can't really pin them down historically. But I think the period that I'm looking at where Buddhism really becomes popular, we have a fairly good textual tradition early on. And as far as I'm aware, they are all historical figures.
Mm-hmm.
I think from the emic perspective, that wouldn't make much difference because people would regard them as historical either way. But I think this period is where we really have good historical documentation, and they are real people.
And how does it grow? I mean, do you get just a handful of monks living together, which is very much what happens for the West, and then it would you'd gain a patron possibly, and then you'd have a kind of cenobitic life, but before that you'd get a sort of eremitic life. Now, I mean, I can imagine that when you've got the extreme climatic conditions of Tibet, you might need more of an established setup, whereas, you know, in the Syrian desert, the Egyptian desert, you could probably survive most of the year in a cave if you had somebody kind to bring you food and so on.
Right.
So do you get a sort of a proper house, or, you know, built monastery at an early stage, or does it sort of drift from this very informal stage onwards?
That's a really nice question. So in Tibet you have both traditions as well. You have the tradition of yogis who sit somewhere in the mountains and meditate on their own, and you have monastic institutions with a community where they have housing and a temple and a kitchen and all the facilities that make life pleasant and safe.
And is there a link between these individuals, as it were, and
the bigger both are an integral part of Tibetan Buddhism, and different traditions have a slightly different focus, but all traditions have both models. And in the more monastic traditions, they very often have something like a meditation outhouse somewhere higher up in the mountains for the people who really want that solitary lifestyle without leaving the monastery altogether. But you also have these famous yogi saints of Tibet where they just sit somewhere on their own and they meditate and they subdue the animals, the wild animals, through the power of their meditation. And the people come and bring them food now and then, but they don't need very much because they are used to fasting. Yes. And in Tibet, because, as you say, it's cold, they have developed a special technique called tummo, in which they learn to generate heat in their body physically, and it works. I mean, they still do these demonstrations today where they wrap themselves in a wet cloth, cotton cloth, and they have a competition who is fastest at generating this inner heat and drying that cotton cloth. So it's a real existing technique. It works. So people have found ways around this harsh climate and dealing with it. Yeah.
Well, that is really fascinating. What about the idea? Presumably, there's some kind of monastic rule for each of these. Is it an individual one for each of these monasteries? Does Retting have something that's different from other monasteries?
Both.
And how does it come about?
Yeah. So there is a general monastic code that the Tibetans have adopted from India, and it's ascribed to the Buddha himself. We know that it has gone through several redactions and stages, and if you take all the monastic vows in that monastic tradition, it's 364 or whatever it is for the Tibetan Buddhists. So it's lots of rules to know and to keep. It's not what every monk in a monastery does, so many have fewer vows. And that's fine, they can still live in the monastery. But if you want to have the full status of a full monk, then you have an awful lot to observe. It's quite complicated. At the same time, monasteries normally also have something like a much easier rule book called the Jayik, which just tells the monks how to behave in everyday life. And that is what is really relevant to people who want to be in that monastery without getting into trouble. So they have a much more reduced handbook specifically for the tradition.
And how does Tibetan Buddhist monasticism fit in sociologically? What sort of niche does it fill? Does it fill a specific sociological need, or is it something that's purely a spiritual call? I'm thinking again in the West of where often sort of surplus children or whatever have been directed into a monastic setting.
Yeah. That is certainly something that's happening as well in Tibet. And also I've heard from many people that actually the monastic lifestyle is quite pleasant, it's quite attractive, because you don't have this very hard physical labor that you would have as a farmer or nomad on the Tibetan plateau. It's quite safe, food is provided, clothing is provided, you have a chance for education in the monastery, very similar to monasteries in Europe as educational institutions. So it's quite an attractive thing to do. Traditionally in Tibet there was a custom that one son would have been given to the military and one to the monastery. So it's literally known as a monk tax. One son from the family goes to the monastery to ensure that there are always enough people in the monasteries. The families then also have certain obligations to support the monastery. So it has financial implications if you want. Obviously, it also plays into that whole issue of who inherits the farm or the livestock. And if you have several sons and you don't want to split it up endlessly, it also makes sense that someone chooses a monastic career and gets the good education and can do all the paperwork for the family. And someone inherits the farm in the end. So, yeah.
Well, the obvious question then is, do women have any function within this kind of setup?
There are nunneries in Tibet. They are, in status, they are not quite as high profile, and in the past, in traditional Tibet, they didn't have the same chances of a high profile education. They had some education, but it was a lower level. And that is changing at the moment, obviously. So it's a big debate at the moment, the rights and the education for nuns and the status of nuns. So currently, there is a big push also from Western Tibetan Buddhist nuns to change that. Yeah.
I ought to leave some time for questions. So.
Yes,
Martin first.
Start on one. We're back in the 11th century. Does anybody complain from the rest of the Buddhist cultures round about that what the Tibetans are doing isn't really Buddhism? It's just what they always did, dressed up.
Yeah. Even some of the Tibetan Buddhists complain about that. So there is this whole debate about, is this proper Buddhism? And Tibetan Buddhism is very ritualistic. It's the tantric tradition coming from India with lots of ritual, esoteric practices. And so there are these esoteric texts, the tantras, where in some cases it's debated whether they really come from India or whether the Tibetans made them up. That is a big issue. Another thing that I always found a bit frustrating is that the biographies and hagiographies of Buddhist teachers that I read, they never tell me what the non-Buddhists said. And we have these life stories, especially in this period, 11th century, where it's all brand new, where the life story says, and already as a child, he was drawn to Buddhism and was very pious, and then he entered a monastery. But his father was a Bonpo, he belonged to the pre-Buddhist tradition of Tibet. And I always wonder, what did the father say? but my hagiographies never tell me that. So there must have been issues going on that we don't really know very much about, unfortunately.
So one thing that came up when you talk about this is, to my understanding, there's like 2 kickstarts needed in Tibetan history to actually get a proper institutionalized monasticism going. So there's this legendary narrative that, of course, Songtsen Gampo initiated this thing, and then his successors took over and tried to make this first thing. Then there's this like Dark Ages, and emerging out of these Dark Ages, you have this monasticism. But I mean, if we look at Tsongkhapa, who says like they did it all wrong, we like have to reorganize everything once more, and then basically just kickstarting this whole thing again in the 15th century. So do you think that working with the hypothesis that monasticism already originated in the 11th century will work for this way? I mean, it's a very official narrative, right?
I don't think so, to be honest, because we can see that in the 11th century, several of the important big monasteries were founded, the Sakya tradition as well, Retting Monastery. So I think this is really the point where it starts, and we can see that these important monastic foundations of the 11th century, they always lead to all these little branch monasteries around that you don't read about in most history books. But if you travel in Tibet, you see them all over.
Right.
And many of them really go back to that time.
Oh.
At least in the region that I'm looking at, I know that they do,
Yeah.
and we know who founded them. And it really comes from Retting, and it really starts in the 11th, 12th century. So I would see Tsongkhapa more as a reformer rather than
Okay.
an initiator. Yeah.
You described, if I understood you properly, the monastery as a kind of microcosm of the sacred mountain and the coordinates around it. Are there further links to that microcosm? Does the head monk stand as the microcosm of the monastery with a coterie of people around him, or his queen and his jewel and so forth? And does that go further down maybe into the body and the mind and so forth?
Right.
Is there such a thing in your cosmology?
That's an interesting question. I don't think so, is the answer. I think what they do, they populate the landscape, but they don't really transfer it onto the monastic community itself. I think they're just there in the middle of it. I've never found any identifications of these elements within the monasteries. They're more all around.
Is the populating of the landscape already a feature that we found in Tantric Buddhism in India, or is it something that is quite original for the Tibetan context?
It's very Tibetan. This form of ideas about sacred landscapes, spirits inhabiting mountains in particular, in the Himalayas obviously, where you have these amazing high mountains. That's something very Tibetan. In India, there is less of that. I mean, you have spirits living in trees, you have tree goddesses in India and things like that, but in the Himalayas and in Tibet, it's a much stronger element of the indigenous tradition, and these mountain gods that we know by name, they are purely Tibetan.
In your list of things which are important, I'm not sure you said anything much about soteriology. So I completely understand that if you're a Tibetan farmer, you need to know that your protected deity isn't going to be sort of swept away by this Buddhist establishment because he's protecting your crops. But didn't Buddhism offer a theory of the afterlife?
Exactly, yeah.
Wasn't there before? I wonder whether that was an element and what made it attractive, or made it easy for people to spread.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the elements that make Buddhism attractive in general, and that's why it was so successful, not just in Tibet, so not just in this case. And it offers, I think it can offer two things that are really important to people. One is, as you say, dealing with the afterlife, and the other also connected with that. If you believe in rebirth and you believe in karma, then your future fate is in your own hands. And I think this opportunity to really shape your own future and make sure that your next rebirth will be better than this one, perhaps, is something terribly attractive. So you don't need a priest to do things for you. You can do it yourself. And I think this feeling of empowerment, being in charge of your fate, must have been something that people found very, very attractive. In addition to all the other things that, for the Tibetans, obviously, Buddhism would also have been the mainstream religion all around them. And if you want to found a kingdom and you want to have international relations with your neighbors, it's quite good to participate in a mainstream international culture, I would imagine. And then also Buddhism offers, in this form, tantric ritual, which again promises you special powers and guarantees your status, your health, your long life. It helps you to defeat your enemies. So all these things that you might also like as a person in power, as a king or whatever. Lots of useful things.
Very briefly.
Yeah, providing Indian lineages, who was proactive? Was it the Tibetans or the Indians?
Yeah, right. The Tibetans were very active in that process. So in India, Buddhism disappears at some point in the early 13th century. Until then, you have traveled both ways. You have Indians going to Tibet to convert Tibetans. They're often invited by the Tibetans. And you also have Tibetans traveling to India to study in the big monastic institutions in India and get an education to study Sanskrit so that they would be able to read the Buddhist scriptures in the original in North India. So it's an exchange both ways, and it stops really at the time when these big monastic universities are destroyed due to the Muslim incursions in North India, and that's when this influx from India stops, and that's when the Tibetans then start building their canon of Buddhist scriptures because they don't get anything new, and so it makes sense to collect everything and say this is our canon.
Just a very brief follow-up. Do you see any repercussion of the fall of the Pala, the Buddhist kingdom, and coming a different dynasty in India after the 11th century?
I mean, what we can clearly see is that what the Tibetans get from India and Nepal and Kashmir is Tantric Buddhism. And in Pala art you see a lot of that. So it just, I guess it just shows the culture and the tradition of the time that you find in North India around that time. Politically, I don't know whether that has any impact. I don't suppose so. Yeah.
We will have to stop there so that there's time for the jury. So.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.